If you've ever been the designated scapegoat in a family of absolute narcissists, you know that the final betrayal rarely comes as a surprise. It doesn't hit you like a lightning bolt out of a clear blue sky. Instead, it comes as a quiet, sickening confirmation of everything you already knew deep down in your bones. When my parents slid a formal 30-day eviction notice across the dining room table, cheerfully announcing that my older brother was taking over my living space, they expected a massive reaction. They wanted me to cry. They wanted me to scream about how unfair it was. I didn't do any of that. I didn't throw a plate or beg for mercy. I just looked at their expectant, self-satisfied faces, and I felt a profound, almost overwhelming sense of relief. Because what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly fathom, was that I had spent the last 10 years building an invisible, impenetrable fortress around myself. I didn't set a trap to destroy them out of malice. I built a massive legal and financial boundary to protect myself, and they had just proudly, arrogantly walked right into it. To truly understand how we ended up at that incredibly toxic dining room table, you have to go back 10 years. The economy was in an absolute freefall, and my parents were drowning in debt. The bank was actively threatening to foreclose on the family home, which was the only tangible asset they had left to their name. I was 22 years old at the time, working as a junior accountant during the day and picking up grueling waitress shifts until 2 in the morning on the weekends. I was hoarding absolutely every single dollar I made because I knew instinctively that I was my only safety net. My parents were deeply proud, deeply image-obsessed people. If I had simply offered them a check, they would have taken the money, but they would have fiercely resented me for seeing them in such a vulnerable state. At the time, I still desperately, foolishly wanted their love and approval. I genuinely thought that if I saved them, maybe they would finally look at me the way they looked at my older brother. So I took a very quiet, very permanent step. I hired a sharp real estate attorney. I created an anonymous LLC, and I used my entire life savings to buy the distressed debt directly from the bank. I essentially bought the physical dirt underneath their house, allowing the bank to restructure their mortgage on the physical dwelling to a fraction of the original cost. When the mail came confirming the new terms, my parents wept with joy, fully believing they had magically qualified for some miraculous government hardship program. I moved into the unfinished, damp basement, paying them what we called rent, which I then secretly used to pay the massive property taxes on the land I now owned. For years, I told myself I was being a good daughter, but as I sat in that dark basement, listening to them upstairs bragging on the phone to relatives about my brother's non-existent achievements, the delusion finally faded. I realized an incredibly hard truth. You cannot buy unconditional love from people incapable of giving it. You can only buy time, and time was rapidly running out. My brother, Liam, is the classic textbook golden child. He is 32 years old, chronically unemployed, and perpetually the victim of circumstance. Over the years, my parents happily liquidated their retirement accounts to fund his luxury backpacking trips, his failed tech startups, and his endless string of terrible decisions. And when he inevitably went completely broke, he came crawling back home, dragging a mountain of credit card debt and a deeply entitled attitude right along with him. By the way, if you're listening to this, and you've ever had to shrink your own existence just to make room for a toxic sibling's massive ego, you might want to hit the subscribe button right now, because you know exactly how suffocating this dynamic is about to get. The exact second Liam moved back into the house, I became entirely invisible again. Actually, it was worse than being invisible. I became an active inconvenience. My monthly rent money was expected, but my physical presence was barely tolerated. The tension in the house built for weeks until that fateful Sunday dinner. My mother had prepared a massive, elaborate feast, completely ignoring the fact that I was severely allergic to half the ingredients on the table. After dessert, my father dramatically cleared his throat. He looked at Liam with pure, unfiltered adoration, and then turned to me with eyes as cold and hard as glass. He announced, in a voice completely devoid of empathy, that Liam needed a fresh start, a real foundation for his future. So they had decided they were legally gifting the house to him, and since Liam needed his absolute privacy to, quote, get his life together, they needed me out of the basement in exactly 30 days. They were casually discarding me like an old, broken piece of furniture. They expected a fight. They wanted me to have a meltdown just to prove their narrative that I was the unstable, ungrateful daughter. But I just calmly wiped my mouth with a napkin, stood up from the table and said I would see them at the family lawyer's office on Tuesday morning to sign whatever paperwork they needed. The look of utter confusion on their faces was priceless, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the reality check that was waiting for them. Tuesday morning arrived, and the air in the family attorney's expensive office was incredibly thick with smugness. Liam was practically vibrating with excitement in his leather chair, already talking loudly about tearing down the load-bearing walls in my basement to build himself a custom home theater. My parents were beaming at him like he had just cured a major disease. I sat perfectly still in the corner, feeling entirely detached from the people in the room. They weren't my family anymore. They were just strangers who happened to share some of my DNA. The lawyer, an older gentleman named Mr. Harrison, adjusted his reading glasses and began carefully reviewing the deed transfer paperwork my parents had so eagerly prepared. The room fell completely silent as his brow furrowed into a deep V. He clicked his computer mouse a few times, frowned heavily, and looked over his glasses directly at my father. He explained in a very dry, strictly professional tone that they could certainly transfer the physical structure of the house to Liam. That was perfectly legal. However, they had absolutely no legal authority to transfer the land the house sat on, because they didn't actually own it. My father let out a loud, condescending chuckle, telling the lawyer to check his computer system again, aggressively reminding him that they had lived on that exact plot of land for over 3 decades. Mr. Harrison didn't argue. He simply turned his monitor around to face the table. The land, he explained calmly, was fully owned by a corporate entity. The ground lease my parents had been operating under was implicitly tied to their primary residence status. Transferring the physical house to a third party would immediately and permanently terminate that ground lease. My mother's face went completely blank. All the color drained from her cheeks. Liam instantly stopped talking about his home theater project. My father slammed his hand on the table and demanded to know who owned the company that bought the land. I slowly unzipped my bag, pulled out the heavy stack of original corporate documents, and placed them gently on the mahogany table. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat or laugh. I just looked at them with the exact same cold, dead indifference they had shown me my entire life. I told them I was the sole owner. I told them all about the secret foreclosure 10 years ago. I explained that my monthly rent was actually just me paying my own property taxes to keep a literal roof over their ungrateful heads. The absolute silence in that room was deafening. It wasn't the silence of people realizing they had made a terrible mistake. It was the panicked silence of parasites suddenly realizing they had just aggressively killed their only host. My mother started to physically hyperventilate, reaching frantically across the table to grab my hand, suddenly using all the sweet, affectionate childhood nicknames she hadn't bothered to use in over a decade. She cried and begged me to understand, claiming they had absolutely no idea, swearing that they loved us both equally. I firmly pulled my hand away from her grasp. I looked her dead in the eye and told her that was exactly the problem. They didn't know because they never cared enough about me to actually look. I then turned to Liam, whose face had turned an extremely ugly, blotchy shade of red. I told him that since the old ground lease was now completely void due to their actions, my new lease rate for the land underneath his brand new house was $12,000 a month, payable immediately. I told him that if he couldn't afford it, he had exactly 30 days to physically remove his house from my dirt. My father absolutely lost his mind. He started screaming at the top of his lungs, calling me a sociopath, threatening to sue me for everything I had. But Mr. Harrison just shook his head, confirming my paperwork was completely ironclad and legally binding. I stood up, walked to the heavy oak door, and looked back at them one last time. I didn't feel a rush of triumphant joy. I just felt incredibly, deeply tired. But for the first time in my existence, I felt truly, unconditionally free. I walked out of that office, got into my car, and permanently blocked all of their phone numbers before I even turned the key in the ignition. I heard months later through distant relatives that Liam immediately signed the house back over to my parents and moved out, leaving them to scramble to pay a strict lease I now have formally managed through a ruthless third-party property management firm. I haven't spoken a single word to them since that Tuesday. Breaking a toxic family cycle isn't always about loud, dramatic revenge. Sometimes it's just about quietly taking your power back, setting an unbreakable boundary, and walking away forever. If this story resonated with you, please drop a comment below and let me know how you handled walking away from the toxic people in your own life. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about finding your peace and taking back your control.